Well, thank you, and I enjoyed hearing your Turkish. You know, I spent some time in Turkey, enough to learn two Turkish phrases, Chris. The first one, kaç para, which means how much is it? I would usually get an answer, and I wouldn't know what they were saying, but at least I knew that they knew that I had asked how much it cost. And the other phrase was bir tane daha, which, if I'm saying it right, means I'll have another one of these. Very useful phrase. You need some more water, some more tea, you need some more hummus, another piece of bread. Bir tane daha. So that is that's my Turkish right there. But it's a great privilege to be here at New Wineskins and to be sharing with all of you about some trends. So that really is the key word that I want to keep in mind. This is Christian mission to Muslims, trends. So we're going to be looking a little bit at what happened in the past so that we could be at the place we are, and then also what is going on in the present. And then if we have enough time, look a little bit into the future. What is going to be happening down the road? I mean, these are not prophecies, but these are informed guesses. So without further ado, let's go ahead and start with the first slide. So really, the whole history of Islam and Christianity, of course, the beginning of the Muslim calendar is in the year 622. That's not when Islam starts. That's when the migration from Medina, or to Medina, happens from Mecca. Muhammad had started prophesying in his ministry, we can call it that, about 10 years earlier than that. But that's the beginning of the Islamic calendar. So that's, if there's one date that you want to memorize, that's it. What was that date again, people? 622. That's an important date, okay? So since 622 up until about the 1960s, conversion from Islam to Christianity, it did happen. But it was very rare, and it was, these conversions were few and far between. When we do have significant numbers of conversions happening, like in Spain, where I live, with the Reconquista, when the Spaniards came down, or the Christians came down and took back land that had been taken from them unjustly in a wanton war of aggression. So I have no problem with the Reconquista on moral grounds of how it happened. But then those people were given the option either to stay in Spain and become Catholics or to leave Spain. Some of them left and some of them stayed. And of course some of them converted, but there were a lot of issues, of course, with that, let us say, the sincerity of that sort of conversion. When someone says, you can stay here with your business and so on, but you've got to become a Catholic, or as they called them back then, the new Christians, right? There were the old Christians and the new Christians. Well, so obviously there's some issues there about sincerity. Now, down the road with future generations, some of those families went on to produce the missionaries that evangelized or that took the Catholic Christian faith to Latin America, Africa, really put Protestants to shame when we were sitting around on our hands saying, well, thank God we're not like the Catholics. The Catholics were sending missionaries all around the world. Well, we're trying to catch up with them. But anyway, it's really in the 1960s when we have a substantial change in direction. In the 1960s, we see something very surprising and very odd happen. What happens in the 1960s? We start to see not only conversions here and there of individuals, but we start to see entire movements, entire communities, substantial numbers of individuals who can then form a church. Because remember that the end point of frontier mission is not just to have individual converts, it's actually to have a body of Christ, whatever that looks like. If that's a bunch of Dalits or Brahmins, or if it's a bunch of people from the same religious background, or people from around the city who have a geographical center, there's a lot of variety there. But the end point of mission is to have that community, to have that body of Christ there. So in the 1960s, we start to see something interesting and really something very surprising happen. We start to see substantial numbers of conversions and even entire movements. They take place in places like Indonesia, Algeria, Iran is one of the most quickly growing ones in the world right now. We heard a little bit about that yesterday. Turkey has not had as quick growth, but you went from a Protestant church of probably double digits to several thousand today, so that's quite significant. And this is happening all over the world. So while I was doing my doctoral work, I got in touch with Patrick Johnstone. Is anyone familiar with Patrick Johnstone? He was the editor of Operation World for many years. And we were talking, and I was trying to get good numbers on the estimates of conversions from Islam to Christianity on a global level. And he had done Operation World, and he had published some other stuff, and he had a couple of little charts like for 5 countries or 10 countries. And I got in touch with him and I said, Patrick, do you have anything more substantial? He's like, well, I've got an Excel spreadsheet, but, and I said, well, are you going to publish that? He's like, I'm retired. I'm going to spend time with the grandkids. And I said, well, Patrick, tell you what, you send that to me. Let me get some of the up-to-date data that I'm getting. Let me put together all of the methodology and stuff like that. Let's work together with this. All you have to do is edit it and make some of the charts. I'll take that data with some of my own data, and we'll publish this. So that was published in 2014 in the Interdisciplinary Journal on Research for Religion, IJRR. And it's called A Global Census in Believers in Christ from a Muslim Background. You can get that at my academia.edu page. But anyway, this graph is from that. So you can see that by 2010, from 1960 through 2010, the blue line right there, oh, I've got a pointer, don't I? How cool is that? Wow.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, I don't usually get this. Okay, so that blue line, that of course is a moderate estimate. So that shows that we've gone from roughly 0 converts in 1960 to approximately 10 million converts in 2010. That's a moderate estimate. The lower estimate is around 6 million. The upper estimate is around 15 million. I think we've tried to use relatively conservative, realistic numbers with this study. Up to date, this is the only study, the only global census of believers in Christ from a Muslim background that has ever been done. And yeah, it's available on the internet. So my question when I look at this, and when I think about trends, right, because that's kind of our focus word. When I think about trends, my question is this. What happened in the world so that we could have a context where these conversions could take place? What happened in the world so we could have a context so that these conversions could take place? So I'm not asking the question, why did they convert? If we have time, I'm going to talk about that later on. I think that's a little bit, more, it's like better trod land, so I want to focus on the less trod land here. So I'm not saying that X, Y, and Z caused the conversions. What I am saying is this. There was something that happened on a global level so that people could hear the Christian message, consider the Christian message, and then say, yes, I am going to make a commitment to that. I'm going to become a Christian. So my question was, how do you research this? What I did was I was able to get in touch with between 30 and 40 skilled, experienced, seasoned missionaries and ministers. Some of them foreigners who worked among Muslims, some of them indigenous Muslims. They're from different backgrounds. Most of them are evangelical because most people working with Muslims and helping Muslims to become Christians are evangelicals, although there are some other people in there, there's 1 or 2 Roman Catholics and things like that. So I asked them this question, and this is what I want to start with. This one. We'll go with this one. Over the last decades, there has been a significant increase in Muslims making some sort of commitment to Jesus and his message as they are portrayed in the Gospels. You have to clarify that very carefully because a lot of Muslims will say, I am completely committed to Jesus. Why? Because Jesus is a Muslim prophet, remember? So there was this one story that came from Morocco. It was a well-intentioned young Christian lady, and she was talking with her friend, and she said, would you like to ask Jesus into your heart? And this young Muslim lady thought, oh, the prophet Jesus is a Muslim prophet. If I could have him in my heart, I would be a better Muslim. So she said, yes, I would like that. For her, she was trying to be a better Muslim. For the young American lady, she's like, yes, I got 1 point for Team Christianity. So you have to be quite clear with this vocabulary. What are some of the factors in your opinion that have led to this? Okay, so we're looking at factors facilitating conversion. This is a picture from Kenya. I just liked it. I put it in there. It has nothing to do with what we're talking about, actually. These are Somali girls living in Kenya. So I got these answers. So here are the main answers that they gave us. And it was free form. Some people wrote like 3 pages. Some people wrote like 2 sentences, right? One of them is media. You're going to hear a testimony later on that my wife Sharon is going to share. And it will have an example of someone who became, who was able to listen to the Christian message, to hear the Christian message, precisely because of media. That used to be radio, and then today it's mostly satellite, TV, and internet. So this is a very, very important thing. However, it's never quite enough, because ultimately God's intention for the church is related to the principle of sacramentality. What is the principle of sacramentality? 2 words. Matter matters. Okay? I didn't invent that. I got that from one of my professors in Edinburgh. Matter matters. I think he's actually a Baptist, but he got it even, okay? So we should definitely get it. Matter matters, right? The Christian message is not just about having ideas. It's about being part of a community and doing certain things in community. So media, again, it's part of it. Second, exposure to other ways of life, thought, and religion. We heard about this yesterday when we heard one brother from a particularly limited country in let's just say the Arab world, and he was saying, a lot of kids are just raised in kind of a religious bubble, and they're taught things like that, that the Shia Muslim kids are born with tails, and then they cut them off. I'd actually never heard that one. But this is certainly something that we're seeing. People are being exposed to other ways of life, other ideas, other ways of thinking. Okay, this is all related to globalization. Third, contextualized or culturally sensitive witness. This has its pluses and minuses, right? You can go too far with this, and this is a hot topic today in the world of missiology. Where do you leave off a contextual or a contextualized witness and then get into syncretism or heresy? Hot topic. I don't want to talk about it. I've got some articles on that if you really are interested in that. But the point is, over the last decades, or last maybe 50 to 100 years, we've become more and more aware that American Christianity, as we're used to it, or British or African or whatever you have, is not necessarily the normative way of being a Christian. And we become more sensitive to that reality. Now, that can backfire. So here's a story from India. There was a group of people working with one of the really low-caste groups. We heard about some of the AFM ministry that's happening in India yesterday. Very inspiring and very encouraging among one of the lower-caste groups. And these Christians had gone in there from England, and they had evangelized them, and they were getting to a point where they were going to build a church. So these missionaries were like, we have gotten over this idea that they have to build an English-style church. They had good intentions, and they said, well, what are we going to do? We are going to help them. We're going to take the model that they have of their previous religious structure, and we're going to build that as a church. So we're going to respect their religious customs. What happened? What did the low-caste people say? They said, no way. Say, we have seen these little drawings in your missionary journals of your little neo-Gothic churches in England, and that is what we want. And they said, that's going to be much harder. You're going to have to quarry the stone, haul it over here. It's more expensive. It's a lot more work. And, you guys are actually building it. And they said, we don't care. Why? Well, for them, leaving behind that old structure was part of emerging into a new identity as Christians. And the only other option they had seen was a typical Anglican church building from England, which is a lot better than a mini mall or whatever we have today here in this country. Okay, you Americans, so strange. Odd people you are. Anyway, so 4, living abroad migration. Now, there has always been a firm connection between migration and religious conversion. Migration is all through. I'm teaching Torah right now at the seminary in Madrid, and migration and conversion is all over the place. So this one is not so new, but what is new about this is the scope of the migration. The scope of the migration is absolutely unprecedented. I was invited by the Lutheran Church in Denmark to give some talks. All of those talks are in English. I do not speak Danish. And all of those are on my YouTube site. So if you go to YouTube, put in Dwayne Miller Islam, you'll see my thing. There's another pastor, Dwayne Miller, who was cured of not being able to speak. So he is rightly more higher in the YouTube ranks than I am. But yeah, blessings on you, Reverend Dwayne Miller at Pinnacle Church. We're friends on Twitter, I guess. So the scope is unprecedented. One of the things that I saw in Denmark as I was talking with the pastors and the teachers they were really just surprised. You know, they're well-intentioned people. The Church of Denmark is a lot like a lot of Anglican denominations. You're going to have a lot of variety, liberal, conservative, very evangelical, very Catholic. You're going to have a lot of diversity, especially as a state church, which is what it is. And so some people, though, were saying, you know, we're being approached by families from like Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria, and they're saying, we're tired of Islam. We don't know much about Christianity, but will you baptize us? So it's a great problem to have, right? It's a great problem to have. So they tried to find someone, ended up being me, to go and to share with them some of those things. But what's the point? That migration is happening at a scale that we have just not seen before in terms of Muslims coming to, I don't want to say the lands of Christendom, I would say the lands that used to be Christendom. And an interesting thing that we're seeing, though, is that the Muslim populations that had already been there, like the Palestinians, that had been settled there and were second or third generation, all the people I spoke with in Denmark, this doesn't mean it's the case everywhere, but they said, oh, they're very closed. They're very closed. But it's the people who are just getting here. They're the ones who have this openness. We're also seeing this in Madrid. The second, third generation Moroccans, a lot of them have just become like Spaniards, which means apathetic in that they're not sure that they believe in anything, right? Kind of like practical hedonists / nihilists. It's an interesting combination. But the ones who are just arriving from Africa, parts of the Middle East, they're the ones who are saying, I need something more, okay? So that is living abroad or migration. This is also related to people who do student ministry. One of the best ways to share your gospel here in the States is to just go to your local community college or university and say, I want to help someone from preferably the Arab world or, the Muslim world. You probably don't want to say someone who's a Muslim because then they're like, really? But to learn and to practice English. There's a lot of demand for that, and it's a great way to get conversations going. During our time after Israel, before moving to Spain, we were back in San Antonio for a while, and we were able to make some wonderful relations around this, either teaching English or helping people who are studying for degrees with things like editing papers and understanding the textbooks and so on. So that's living abroad or migration. That living abroad migration, like I'm trying to drive home, it can be permanent, long-term, or it can be even short-term. And then the fifth thing that people mentioned, and these are, by the way, in order from the most mentioned to the least mentioned. If you look at the number in parentheses, that is showing you basically how many people mentioned this broad category. Fifth one was prayers, the move of the Spirit, and God's timing. We are so lucky to have amazing resources for prayer today. What would you do 50 years ago if you wanted to pray for missionaries to Muslims? There were probably, your denomination probably had like a journal or a bulletin that came out every now and then. What did you do 100 years ago? Or 2, or 3, or 4, or 5, or 1,000, 500 years ago, or 1,000 years ago? You just didn't have any ability to really pray for these things with any kind of knowledge. You didn't have the ability to pray for any of these things that were up to date. You could be still praying for Brother Ahmad, but it turns out that Brother Ahmad had been, kicked out of Egypt 6 months ago and was living in Rome. Okay. So we now have this ability, again, because of globalization, because of the communications revolution, to be much more informed in terms of our prayers. One of my favorite resources is Operation World. Everyone here familiar with Operation World? Yeah. Operation World is basically kind of a dictionary of the countries around the world from A to Z From the big ones to the little ones, you can find Vatican City in there. You can find, I don't know, what's another little country? Monaco, Swaziland, all those fantastic countries. And you can find those in there, and it will tell you, basically in about a page, what's going on. It'll tell you about the population, who are Christians, what kind of Christians are they. It is an evangelical publication, but I like that it doesn't poo-poo non-evangelicals. I don't like doing that. And it will give you some key prayer points and difficulties. If you have a missions committee or an outreach committee, get the book and open your meetings by just choosing a country. Whether it's something that was in the news or whether you go from A to Z, get the book. I know it's on sale here because I went downstairs and I saw it somewhere. So get it. It's fantastic. And you can also get it online as an online resource. So those are just a couple of examples of how we are able to pray in a much more informed way. And then, of course, we have God's timing. Especially my dear Reformed brothers like mentioning. Ultimately, and I love one of them who's a brother that I really respect. He said, well, here are some things, A, B, C, D, and E, and F. But ultimately, it's just the sovereignty of God. He just chose to do this right now. Fine. That's the great thing. That's the great thing. God is sovereign. There's free will. Beautiful. Okay. So, but God's timing. God's timing. God has a plan to bring Muslims to Christ, and it's happening right now. The window is open. How long is the window going to be open? Windows for ministry open, and then they close sometimes. Has everyone had that experience in life? No? Some people know. Okay. Trust me, it happens. We have a window right now that is open. A window to reach Muslims. Okay? It is more open in some places than others. It's more open among some ethnic or people groups than others. But it is open in a substantial way in much of the world. And that is God's timing. Okay, so, and I want you to notice the interesting mixture here, right? Some of these things are not particularly religious, like communications. Some of them are very theological or transcendental, like God's timing, a move of the Spirit. Some of them are related to specifically missiological or things that come from missionary thinking, like contextualization and culturally sensitive witness. So those are the first 5. This is all covered in much more detail in Living Among the Breakage, by the way, which is an academic book. Yeah, I had to do it because it was for a PhD. But anyway, it's in there. If you like this stuff and you want to know much more about it, and you want to know my methodology, it's all in there. So here are the other 5 that I got. Dreams, visions, and miracles. So here's another one of those transcendental things. And what's interesting about dreams, visions, and miracles, let me make 2 points. First of all, they appear to be more common among some people groups than others. I don't know how to explain that. Another thing is, it is quite possible that people have been having these dreams and visions and miracles for centuries, but they just didn't have anywhere to go with them. 200 years ago, you're in a little village in Libya, and you have a dream, and you think that it's Prophet Jesus or one of the saints or an angel or something like that. What do you do with that? Where do you go? Even if you can get to Tripoli, okay, which is probably not likely. But if you're a young man, maybe. If you're a young lady, no way. Let's say you get to Tripoli. Then what do? You got to track down a church. You got to find someone who can speak to you in your language, someone who's willing to speak to you in your language, someone who thinks that you're worth speaking to in their language, right? And at that point in time, there's probably some chaplaincies or stuff like that, but those are for military or diplomatic groups or whatever. So, what do? So one of the missionaries, and I thought this was a great insight, although I have not tested it, is he said that he thought that these dreams and visions had been happening for centuries, but people just had nowhere to go. But today, wow, you can go online and you can just Google, I had a dream of Jesus in Arabic, and you're going to find a number of different websites. Okay? So there's a lot more connectivity. There's a lot more places to go with your questions that before you never could do. 7, a greater number of missionaries. Of the Muslim world, we kind of tried reaching the Muslim world during the Ottoman period. I love the Ottoman period. My favorite thing about going to Egypt, people use the honorific Effendi. And I'm like, I feel like I'm back in the Ottoman period. Because in Israel, Palestine, Jordan, they don't use Effendi. They use Ustad, which is like teacher, or Professor, which I'll let you guess what that actually means in English. So a greater number of missionaries. For a long time, Christians had a very ill-informed and very kind of naive vision of what Islam was. They're like, oh yes, sand dunes and camels and, a sheikh with a turban and a scimitar. Oh, wow, fantastic stuff. Figs, right? Things like this. But then a couple of global events happened. This was before I was born, but does anyone remember when all of a sudden countries where oil came from decided not to sell oil anymore? When was that? Yeah, I was born in 78, so I have no memory of that. But that was kind of one of the things where even the West was like, wow, these people actually have some influence. Maybe they're worth listening to, at least if we want to be able to drive all over the place like we're used to after post-World War II America. And then other things happened. 9/11 happened. If Islam was not on the radar of American churches after 9/11, it was. And other things happened in Europe too. So all of a sudden, Islam goes from being this kind of like distant thing. The main problem is communism, and the Muslims, at least they're monotheists with us, okay? We'll we'll give weapons to the Taliban, the students who's trained in Pakistan and went down to Afghanistan to fight the communists. We did that. I'm sure strategically and politically it made sense at the time. But then communism collapsed, and Islam became something that was on the radar, for better or for worse, of American churches. A lot of American Christians just became xenophobic and angry, but guess what? He has not given us a spirit of fear, but of
love, power, self-discipline.
Okay, so the 10% of you that used to be Baptists know that verse. Very good. But yeah, he has not given us a spirit of fear. He's given us a spirit of love, power, and a sound mind, self-discipline, different translations. But it all goes to the same place, right? So instead of being afraid of Muslims, we should say, well, how can I love this person? How can the power of God come through in this relationship rather than my own fear? I was speaking at a church once in San Antonio, and a guy said, well, what if the guy who moves in across the street from me is a terrorist and wants to blow me up? And I said, that's a very easy situation to address. You have explicit instructions from Jesus. That guy's your enemy. What do you do with your enemy? There you go. We don't get like such clear indications from what to do from Jesus that often. We're like, well, should we replace the carpet in the fellowship hall? Well, Jesus apparently has very little to say on that topic, but in terms of the terrorist across the street, no problem. So, greater number of missionaries, and that's precisely because the church started waking up. That's also related to prayer. It's related to the 1040 window, and who was that guy who came out with a 1040 window? Anyway, that's all in the book. But Christians started focusing on the unreached. And that's exactly where AFM comes from 25 years ago, right? Or is it 26 now?
It's 26.
26, yeah. Around 25, 26 years ago. Is precisely that awareness of unreached people groups. So we are part of that. We are all here today because of that awareness. Then 8, translation of the Bible and material into local languages, dialects, and forms. For a long time, you had the trade language, right? And we heard about this with the wonderful work going on in a certain area, Asia Minor, we'll just say, of really trying to get material into the local heart language of the people. I was sitting down with the Moroccan guy who just had come across from Morocco. He's back in Morocco now. And we were studying. He said, I don't know much about Christianity, but I want to be a Christian, and will you baptize me? We get these every couple of months through our Arabic fellowship in Madrid. And I said, well, let's meet, let's talk, let's get to know each other. And we sat down, and I had my Van Dyke Bible in good classical Arabic, courtesy of the Presbyterians in the Ottoman Empire, okay, which is what most Arabic churches use, and I had it on my phone. And he had a New Testament that I had been able to get in colloquial Moroccan Arabic. So we were going back and forth between the two. And I said, which one do you like? And he's actually a young man who could read very well, which is not that common in the Arabic world. Like being able to read complicated text well is not necessarily a common skill among Arabs. But anyway, he definitely was able to read quite well. And he said he liked them both, but I love what he said about this dialect. He said, this is definitely Moroccan dialect, but this is from my neighboring region, right? So it was so close to home, that he was like, oh yeah, this is my people. It's right next door to my people. But he could get that. That sort of thing did not exist in previous centuries, even in some previous decades. Here you got to tie in technology. Do you know how much easier technology has made Bible translation? It is absolutely amazing. I mean, I'm not a Bible translator. I'm involved in that whole discussion of when you can use the word Allah in what languages to translate Elohim, Yahweh, and Theos. Don't want to get into that right now. But the point is, some of these technological advancements and communications advancements have just revolutionized and made this much less expensive and a lot faster. So, and that's just a few examples. Greater diversity in missionary strategies and platforms. So here at New Wineskins, you can go to talks on BAM. BAM. What does that stand for?
Business and mission.
Business as mission, yeah. So that is a new platform. That is not something that used to exist. And I could mention a number of other examples. So people are being creative because the old I'm going to get a missionary visa because I'm a subject of the British Empire going to Lahore, and I need to, some of those exist in some places, but they're getting further and farther between. So Christians have become more creative, right? And figured out how can we use our earthly skills to gain entry to these countries. And of course, if you're doing business as mission, you better have integrity and actually do the business and do it well, right? That's a problem sometimes. But I think as long as you do that, you're on solid ground. So we have a greater diversity in strategies and platforms. And then finally, you have a greater boldness in evangelization. Notice that this is, of the 10, the least mentioned one. So this is all going into there's me over in Istanbul. There we go. So these are 10 factors facilitating conversion. These are 10 factors that describe what has changed in the last 50, 60 years that have created a global context so that Muslims can increasingly convert to Christianity. Okay. So we're talking about trends. So if we're looking at trends, I think what we want to do is we want to ask, are these 10 things still in effect? Are they becoming stronger? Are they becoming weaker? Okay. So with that in mind, I want to go back here to this other trend. So here's another trend called demographics. What is demographics? Come on, this is basic Greek, people. Yeah, the study of populations. That's what it is. It's one of the social sciences, closely related to sociology, economics, demographics. One of the main things that demographics is going to look at is population growth, population decline, migration, and, in some cases, religious conversion. Now just take a look at Europe. Now this one is only a couple years old. I think it's from 2014. It's from Pew, which I think is usually a pretty solid source of information. Every now and then they have some problems, some issues. But I mean, the growth of the Muslim population throughout the countries of Europe is absolutely massive. Most of these countries 50 years ago would have had between 0 and 1%, even between 0 and 0.5%. And this is a huge thing. So one of the things that came up yesterday was about, are there cracks in the foundation of Islam? Does anyone remember, was anyone here yesterday when we talked about that? And then somebody had asked me about that in the hallway, and it got me thinking. I'm like, I got to share that. Can I have my bottle of water down there, please? Oh, you're pregnant and you bent over for me. Thank you. Very kind of you. I hope baby doesn't step on your bladder and make you go to the bathroom now. Okay. So, the future belongs to them that procreate. The future belongs... So, obviously the future belongs to AFM, right? But the future does belong to them that procreate. There are three main things that are going to affect the religious population, okay? One of them, and by the way, if anyone wants this PowerPoint, email me. There's my email address over there. No, it's not over there. There you go. She's not pregnant. She can run around. She's fine. We brought 3 children into the world, praise be to God, so that's not bad. So if anyone does want this PowerPoint, email me, or any of the papers or resources that I'm mentioning, email me, and I'll get that to you. Some people are like, oh, I don't want to bother you, but I have a question. It doesn't bother me. This is part of my work. This is something that I love doing. So if you're going to use this information for ministry or for scholarship, it is not a bother. It is part of what I do, and the reason that me and my family and AFM have invested in hopefully forming a semi-well-informed scholar. So what are those 3 things that are going to affect the religious population? Migration, fertility, and conversion. So while we looked at that chart that showed a very substantial increase in conversion, guess of those 3, which is the least, by and large, which is the least significant of those 3 factors? The one that has the least impact? Conversion. Yeah, I think it's something like 97% of all human beings are going to stick with the religious tradition that they were brought up in. In this postmodern world, that might be shifting a little bit more, but man, even if you go down from 97, you're still staying pretty high. That doesn't mean that people are going to stay in the same denomination. Now, the children may be less conservative or less liberal than the parents. They might be less devout or more devout, okay? But by and large, humans just have this kind of momentum to stick with the religious tradition that they were brought up in. Do you know one of the main ideological traditions where people defect more from Christianity? Atheism. Children brought up in explicitly atheistic households tend to be the ones to defect from their parents' ideology more than anyone else. Do you know who really tends to stick with their religious tradition even more than Muslims? Mormons. So I don't know what the Mormons are doing, but they're doing something right that we're not doing. Okay, so anyway, this is just a trend. I don't see any reverse in this trend. I mean, there's always politicians talking about limiting migration and so on and so forth, but I don't see that happening. And even if immigration from the Muslim world to Europe were to stop, just based on the demographics, Islam would continue to grow and become more and more substantial. I'm not a person who's trying to say, oh, the Muslims are taking over and blah, 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 but just based on demographics, migration, and yes, even conversion patterns, there is no question that Europe and North America as well, especially Canada, are going to become increasingly Muslim. So that's a trend. That's a trend that we have to think about. What happens when a city government is 10% Muslim, or 20% Muslim, or 30% Muslim? What happens, and you don't need a majority to control a government. What do you need? You don't need 50% plus 1. You just need a greater percentage than anyone else has. What is that called?
Plurality.
A plurality. So when people are like, oh, there's not going to be a Muslim majority, I'm like, no one cares about a majority. What matters? A plurality. Okay, a plurality doesn't mean you're going to control everything, but by and large, having a plurality means that you become the biggest fish in the tank. Okay? And yeah, are Muslims leaving Islam more than before? Absolutely. And another thing that's happened, and this is a very recent trend.
5 minutes. 5 minutes.
5 minutes. And this is a very recent trend, okay? By the way, if you like this material, find it interesting, a lot of more videos on YouTube, both in English and in Spanish, okay? So check that out. But one of the things, and I'll wrap up with this, one of the most recent trends that we're seeing, okay, in addition to the factors facilitating conversion in those 10 trends, in addition to the demographic trend that Islam is growing in the West, and I don't see any way that it will stop growing, is this. And this is an interesting one. It's very recent, only in the last year or two, that unless you really have your finger on the pulse of what's going on, you're not going to be aware of. Groups of ex-Muslims coming out and explicitly saying, we have left Islam, and wanting to have a public voice in the public arena. So there are councils of ex-Muslims. They have different names in different places, but there are councils of ex-Muslims in the UK, in the United States, and in several other Western countries. You're also seeing something that you didn't see before, even in countries like Saudi Arabia, Pakistan, countries where, leaving Islam is very dangerous. What does the Sharia say about the person who leaves Islam? Man baddala dinahu faqtaluhu. Whosoever changes his religion, slay him. That's not radical, that's not extremist, it's basic, traditional, orthodox Islam. Fortunately, most Muslims don't do that, but some of them do, okay? So it's surprising to see people in countries like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan coming out and explicitly saying, I have left Islam. I am an ex-Muslim. If you really want to read this stuff and get in touch with some of these people, anyone want to guess what's the best venue for that? What's a great venue where everyone just says whatever they feel like and to heck with everyone else? Twitter, yes. See, Jeff knows about Twitter. I follow you religiously on Twitter.
I'm tweeting right now.
It's a great honor to meet you and to be in your presence. So that's fascinating. What does that mean? People, even within the country, this is totally unheard of. So that when you talk, are the cracks in the foundation of Islam breaking? Well, I've got to point to a real strength here, which is that of demography and fertility. There are some Muslim countries that have low fertility, but by and large, if you get the average of Christian countries, sub-Saharan Africa is its own thing, right? But of Western countries versus Muslim countries, the fertility in Muslim countries is, on average, higher. Well, anyway, we'll wrap it up with that, and thank you for your time and your attention.
Okay. Yes.